an original MCM production.
Now I'd like to ask Ben Wagner, trial lawyer at Habush, Rotary, to introduce our speaker today.
Good afternoon. When I sat down and I met Ann Reed, she asked, well, why are you introducing the chief? And the response was my relationship with Safe and Sound. And I know that the chief has spoken to our group before, so I'm going to keep this relatively brief because I've heard the chief speak and it's nothing short of phenomenal. Briefly, the chief graduated from LaSalle University, went on to get his master's degree in criminal justice, also graduated from the FBI National Academy. His career has been wonderful. He has been chief of police in several departments, most notably was the chief of police in Arlington, Virginia, when September 11th happened. He helped formulate the government's response to that terrible tragedy, and somehow, some way, we got him to come to Milwaukee in 2008. And since then, the Milwaukee Police Department, under his leadership, has made major victories and has gotten several major awards and acknowledgments, including the international award called the Weber Seavey Award, which goes to the highest achiever in community-based policing. And this was a huge honor given that it's an international award. Not only does the chief lead well within his department, he also lends his time, talent, and energy to nonprofit community work such as Safe and Sound. I had the honor and privilege of serving on Safe and Sound's board along with Joanne Anton and the others mentioned, while the chief was chairman of the board where he served for 4 years strongly and successfully during a time of transition of leadership. When I think about the chief and apply it to our principles here, the chief, as you may know and will know, speaks the truth whenever he speaks, whether it be about intergenerational poverty or gun control. Is it fair to all concerned? Well, the chief's community-based policing model has its primary goal to be fair to all concerned, not only to his people on the force, but also to the residents. Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Well, that is the inherent goal of community-based policing, to be fair to the police and the residents they serve. And finally, will it be beneficial to all concerned? Well, the goal of community-based policing is to involve its residents and the police officers together to achieve the common goal of public safety. So it's my honor and privilege to introduce Chief Edward Flynn.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and now I really feel like there's a great deal of pressure on me because I think the introduction may be more instructive than the actual talk. I think obviously you can learn a lot from the Rotary mottos that are here behind me. They apply to so much of life. I first became familiar with them decades ago when my girlfriend, soon to be my fiance, and ultimately, bad luck for her, my wife, got a Rotary International Fellowship. And this was right after she graduated from college. And she was going to go off to Wales for a year and leave me behind. I was already on the job. And I figured I better get her a ring. So she went to England, but she had a big rock on her finger the whole time she was over there. So it, hopefully, I think that stimulated me to make a good decision. Very happy to be here. Happy to have an opportunity to speak to thought leaders, opinion leaders, people who are active in their community and are able to interact with a wide variety of people. And I try to take advantage of these situations and say things that you may find useful. So I'll kind of back into it a little bit. First of all, if I say any facts at all, I am prepared to try to verify them. Allow me a margin of error. It may be 105 or 2, somewhere in that range if I pull out a number. So there's a margin of error in every number I come up with. But having said that, clearly this last year has been an extraordinarily difficult one for my profession. It has been dispiriting. It has been more than depressing. I have 2 children. One of whom is a high school English teacher, and the other one is a police officer in Washington, D.C. And the 2 of them, they have discovered, are responsible for all of the America's ills. All right? If you can't find anybody to blame, blame the teachers and blame the cops. It's all their fault. And the 2 of them are mid-career. They're both 10 to 15 years in. And they entered both of those professions full of ideals. They still have ideals, but it is hard to maintain those ideals when what your profession is about is so politicized. And I would say the 2 professions right now most important to the healthy functioning of society are policing and education, and both of them are grist for the political mill. And alas, we live in a world in which people would rather have talking points than solve problems. Interesting, I stumbled over a quote not long ago, and it's a French writer, and his name started with B, and it's not Baudelaire, so I can't remember who it was now. But it really struck me, the power of the quote. It said, the worst kind of lie is a problem misstated. Just let that marinate for a little bit. And I guess it's a version of operating from a false premise. If you have a set of assumptions about something that is, in fact, wrong, you have the wrong premise, the problem has been misstated, any discussion or problem solving you want to do is going to take you in a gradually increasing progression away from the problem. It's going to distract you from what it is you're trying to do. And this is a challenge for many of us in public life, and I think it has been very much a backdrop to my engaging in this past year's troubles. Back up a little bit. Whenever I come to this building, I can't help but reflect on my father and grandfather. And recently, just in this last year, I've been collating, finally, I'm in my 60s, and finally I have accepted the burden of memorabilia, things left to me in boxes. And I have my grandfather's letters from World War I. And I have my father's letters from World War II. Written from the same places. Repeating history, if you will. My father was a combat infantryman, a lieutenant. My grandfather was a medical doctor. And back in World War I, the medical doctors were in the trenches. I mean, it was not far removed from Civil War medicine. So he was right up at the front, writing these passionate letters to his wife and his parents. And then re-engaging with that struck me very profoundly because I looked at that time, and some of his letters referred to the Civil War because his wife was from Georgia. He was from New York. And her family, no fooling around, disapproved of that marriage. I mean, he was an Irish Catholic from New York marrying into this Georgia family for whom the memories of invasion and conquest were still fresh. All right? Still, there was animosity. And I was stunned to think about it for a minute. The Civil War was as far from World War I as I am now from the start of my career. Okay? Maybe a little longer, but give or take 5 years, okay? But what strikes me about it is the things that were happening at the beginning of my career are echoing now again. And the things that were happening in my career then were echoes of what had happened 100 years before. And the challenge when I stumbled over this quote, a problem misstated, is if we only deal with picked out symptoms of larger problems, we never get at the root of the challenges we're trying to deal with. It doesn't mean you don't deal with symptoms. Of course you do. But you can't do that in ignorance of what has gone before. Forgetting history is the first dreadful mistake you can make. And I say that now because you'll be hard-pressed in any of the news coverage of our ills in the last year, my professions, other professions, to see any context or perspective in any of the coverage. Right? Any. Now, it's not entirely the news business's fault, although I'm happy to blame them for it. The industry is under dramatic pressure, like many other industries are. Okay? In-depth stories are generally a thing of the past. It's all about being first with information in an era of Snapchat and Twitter and whatever the hell else people are using to share meaningless information with each other rapidly. It's all about speed. And if there's one thing I know about speed, is something you probably all know about speed. Speed is the enemy of truth and accuracy. Cardinal rule of policing: first reports are always wrong. Does anybody remember hands up, don't shoot? I remember watching the TV when the newspaper reporter or a TV reporter stuck his microphone in the mouth, or excuse me, in the face of one of the individuals in the street that day. It's the day of the shooting. What happened? He was running away with his hands up, and the cop shot him in the back. Now, that was worldwide news within seconds. It is a chant heard frequently at demonstrations. It put thousands of people in the street. There's only one problem with it. It didn't happen. Now, I'm not here to defend anything that occurred there or anything else. What I am here to say is a problem was misstated immediately and drove conduct and drove reactions. I had a surprising interaction not long ago. I was at Northwestern University. They want to reconfigure their criminal justice programs for police practitioners, and I was part of a work group that got together for a day and did some brainstorming. And the fellow that's sitting next to me is a PhD in public administration, spent his career in Missouri, and he's been appointed by the governor to the police commission in Ferguson. So he did a little bit of talking, not a lot. It wasn't why we were there. But I said to him, you know, in terms of context and perspective, I said I was at a meeting with Eric Holder with a group of police chiefs, and I posed a question that nobody knew the answer to. And it was really posing a question in the form of how do we understand police use of force in the 21st century? Okay? How do we understand it? Do we understand it from 6 or 8 videos from around the country? Do we understand it through data? Do we understand it through stories? Do we understand it comparing it to something? What's the denominator? What was the past? What is the current situation? So I said to him, Eric Holder, and I repeated this question to this gentleman, I said, do we have any idea how many people the Ferguson Police Department has shot and killed in the line of duty in the last 10 years? I mean, is it a crisis in Ferguson? I mean, I know they write a lot of tickets, and I knew they certainly annoyed the hell out of a lot of people, and apparently were basically balancing the budget of Ferguson, as so many of those jurisdictions were. But I said, what's their use of force history? We know there's a crisis down there right now. How many people have they shot and killed? I had no idea. Attorney General didn't either. And there is no data bank nationally to track police use of deadly force, which was my larger point. How do I know where or what is a norm compared to what when it comes to the police use of deadly force or the police use of force? And if we don't have any data, how on earth can we figure out what's outside the normal range? Because that's when you start asking real questions. Obviously, you ask questions about every incident. But in terms of looking for a pattern or a practice or a trend, what's the normal range? What's a lot less? What's a lot more? How come that's so little? How come that's so much? How come this tilts towards there? We need to have information in order to make thoughtful judgments. So I sat next to the guy from Ferguson. I said, okay, how many people in the Ferguson Police Department shot and killed in the line of duty in the last, I don't know, 20 years? He said, I don't know. I said, wouldn't that have been the first thing out of the chief's mouth after I'm sorry is this is a rare event or it's a frequent event, so I better, retire now? Wouldn't we want to know that? So he says, let me make a phone call. So he makes a phone call. He said, well, we only had data going back to 2000. No, I'm sorry. He said 30 years. Yes, it was 30 years. Okay. I said, how many in the last 30 years? He said 2. The second one was last year. Now, excuses nothing. But what I am trying to say, if you're an average person consuming the news, you would have been reasonable to assume that what we had there was the Gestapo, as opposed to perhaps a blunder, perhaps not, but not part of a dramatic pattern of the use of deadly force. Now, there are people, I think, beginning to study it. We found, for example, that the national database kept by the FBI is very spotty. I think it recorded in 1 year 400 uses of deadly force not 400 uses of deadly force, 400 people killed in 1 year by the police. It was low compared to prior years, but there's no mandated reporting. So we don't know. We don't know what the normal range is. We don't know what the average circumstances are for the whole country because the reporting is voluntary. There's much we don't know. Why am I saying all of that? Well, because I go back and I'm reading letters that are 100 years old talking about problems that were 50-year-old, that now we're talking about problems 100 years later, it's the same thing. What was I learning back when I started out in police? Well, a couple of years before I started in policing, we had riots all over the country, all right? The place where I would go to work, Jersey City, had a riot. The place where I was born, Newark, New Jersey, had a riot. Milwaukee had a riot. Los Angeles had a riot. Terrible riots. Detroit watched them on TV. I watched America's cities on fire as a boy. What's going on? Now, aside from the fact that some of these were still problems unresolved from 100 years ago, because back then we were celebrating the centennial of the Civil War, we were also seeing this crisis of confidence in our social order and our means of social control, and indeed the entire system of governance. So what happened? President Johnson signed an order creating the President's Commission on Law Enforcement and the Administration of Justice and said, in 1 year, I want a report that digs in to all of the inequities being discussed currently about the operations of the criminal justice system. How does it work? What needs to be done? How can it be reformed? What's the federal role to reform it? A few months later, he signed an executive order creating the Kerner Commission, which was on the causes and preventions of civil disorder. And that analyzed what had happened in the riots that were plaguing us. So we'd had the '64 election. Crime in the streets was a big Goldwater argument. Crime rates were skyrocketing in the 60s. Let's study criminal justice. Oh, we've had a series of riots. Let's study what's going on. And the reports they wrote were landmark. I read the report. I've got the dog-eared copy of the President's Commission report because I read it when I got out of college, trying to say, what am I going to do that's meaningful? And I picked up this thing and I'm like, whoa, this is really important. Some of the great scholars in America were analyzing how we did justice. And they made a series of recommendations for the courts. They made a series of recommendations for corrections. They made a series of recommendations for police. No one has come as close as the police have generally to operationalizing many of those recommendations. And many of them now, 50 years later, look very much a product of their time. But the point is the following. Back then, they identified a core problem in American policing. At that time, they identified, I think, something on the order of 12,000 police agencies in the United States with approximately 500,000 employees. And their point was, this is an extraordinarily fragmented way to police a society, and the standards of professionalism go from no professionalism at all, here's your gun and your badge, to fairly high levels of professionalism. Look at the FBI, okay? This is a national problem, they said, for which there need to be some levels of national engagement because, funny premise, which I kind of agree with a lot, where you live and your zip code number should not entitle you to less safety than somebody else in another zip code. It seems to me if you're an American citizen, you have a right to protection, both fair and impartial protection, but the first order of business, protection. Because we have people living in our neighborhoods in this very city who should not have to live that way. We have a famous zip code, 53206, and I always hear about it because so many prisoners come from there. And it's usually hurled in my face as an accusation. Look at all the people arrested in 53206. The only response I have is the national homicide rate is 4 per 100,000. The homicide rate in 53206 is 250 per 100,000. Now, nobody should have to live in that kind of circumstance, but we do. And so what they were saying back in the 60s was, federal government needs to get involved. It needs to set some standards. It needs to put some money on the street and say, let's see if we can provide better levels of public safety for people, not dependent on where they live, but because this is an important profession. So the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration was created. Big piece of that was research into the dimensions of the problem. This came out about the same time the Kerner Commission issued its report. And what did the Kerner Commission report conclude? It said in every urban conflagration, the flashpoint had been the police. But they weren't the fundamental cause. That there was anger and frustration and a sense of helplessness in the face of a government that was not seen as responsive to them, as a social order that was perceived as unfair, and the police as the most visible representatives of society and the most intensively used, I might add. The vast majority of calls for service continue to be in our most disadvantaged neighborhoods. They were the symbol of all that was felt to be wrong. And so therefore, more needed to be done in education. Why? Because at that time, the schools in the cities were a disgrace. More needed to be done in terms of housing. Housing was a disgrace in many of our central cities. And more needed to be done to prime the economy, because joblessness and intergenerational joblessness was a serious issue. Efforts were made to fix those things. Some were successful, some were partially successful, some were complete failed social engineering. But efforts were made because the problem was stated as a complex, interrelated problem. Okay? Flash forward 50 years, I feel like this is where I came in. Except there is no discussion about context or perspective or the past. We have found the enemy, it's the police. And if we can identify police officers as somehow the other, if we can just talk about this one component of society's response to its social problems, we don't really have to talk about anything hard or make any hard decisions. Over the arc of my career, I've seen us disinvest in the social safety network. During the arc of my career, I saw us close up all of our mental hospitals because we were going to have this incredibly robust network of community-based mental health services. Okay? Who are the mental health professionals of first resort now? The police. Have a homeless problem. Who are the people in charge of homelessness? We have families that are stressed by income, circumstance, and lack of parenting skills. This results frequently in disputes. This results frequently in families in crisis. Who do we call? You're on the right track. Us, okay? The police have become the social agency of first resort for the poor. On one hand, it's what makes our job a vocation. On the other hand, not knowing that the vast majority of police work in our central cities is overwhelmingly a form of social work, not knowing that the relationships of the police and the community are complex, they are nuanced, they are braided, they are very, very difficult to generalize about, but also recognizing that one of the ills those neighborhoods suffer from is extraordinary disparate victimization by violent crime. If you don't know any of those things nor talk about them, but only talk about how the police do their job when they do it badly, you're misstating a problem. I've recently said in a few different venues, I'm over having the parallel conversations. And the parallel conversations in America right now are this. I go to a neighborhood meeting and everybody wants to talk about crime and disorder and fear, and the police need to do more. That is in every neighborhood in this city, but nowhere more than in our poorest neighborhoods. They want streets where they can pursue the American dream and their children can go to school in safety. They want to strive, but they are afraid. And where there is fear, there is not true democracy. Think about it. The emerging democracies of the Middle East or Southern Europe. All right? The first institutions under attack by those who would destabilize a democracy are the institutions of justice, particularly the police. All right? Why? Because fear divides people and makes it impossible for them to work together. That's the true challenge we have right now. Police performance and its fairness and its professionalism are crucial aspects of it, but we can't talk about the problems we're dealing with on one side of the ledger and over the other side of the ledger talk about the problems of the institution. They've got to be talked about at the same time. They connect to each other. All right? Where the police are is where they're asked to be, because that's where the need is greatest. And in that context, bad decisions are sometimes going to occur. I'll leave you with two thoughts, and there's one challenge that we face with our young officers. Number one, people spend their entire lives learning not to stare, not to ask embarrassing questions, and to mind their own business, right? Did you ever hear that growing up? Right? We socialize people their whole lives. What do we ask police officers to do? Do we ask them to mind their own business? Do we ask them not to stare? Do we ask them to not ask embarrassing questions? No. So I have to re-socialize properly brought up boys and girls to do three socially unacceptable things as a key part of their job. The other part of their job is the following. They've got to make critical decisions under pressure with insufficient information and ambiguous circumstances. That's the essence of the job. And my job in holding them accountable is to differentiate between a flawed judgment under pressure and wrongdoing. And flawed decisions under pressure have to be dealt with appropriately. Maybe be training and it may be firing, but within the institutions. Misconduct can result in going to jail, but an error under pressure is no different in the streets of America than it is in Afghanistan or Iraq. When one of our people in Afghanistan or Iraq accidentally bombs a village, we don't necessarily make that person a war criminal. Their career's over, right? They're held accountable, but the assumption is in pursuing an appropriate goal, they did the wrong thing and there were really bad consequences and we can't have you in our profession anymore. But the instinct of America isn't to put them in jail. And so our challenge here is clearly to hold people accountable appropriately, but also draw those moral distinctions between intentional harm and inadvertent or judgmental error. Kind of all over the place today, but so has been my brain this last year. So at any rate, if there's any thought to leave you with, it's just this. We've got to do a better job of defining the problems we're trying to deal with right now. And it's devoid from the public discussion right now. And if we can start getting the problem statements right, we can start devising solutions that will be really helpful. Because at the end of the day, when all of my cops have body cameras, okay, is the homicide rate in 53206 still going to be 250 per 100,000? Or maybe we need to talk about both situations at the same time. So let's do the questions. It'll probably be more interesting than the speech.
MCM production.